I got to change the voice of that person.
Very, very straight to the point. It's great.
It's so funny. It makes me laugh every time.
I love it.
Um, awesome. Any questions or anything for me before we get started?
No, I don't think so.
Awesome.
All
Okay.
good.
So I'll start with my first question. And we'll follow all the ones that you've seen pretty much and just kind of
Sure.
play around as we go.
Sounds good.
So super cool. Your clinical research focuses on novice clinician burnout, which I didn't know that could be a focus. That's really important and cool. And professional practice of self-care, so important. So could you tell me a little bit more about that and maybe some things that you've learned in studying that?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the reason the topic is really close to my heart is because I like as both as a human being just out in the world with loved ones that I care about, as well as a professional in the field and doing this work every day, 9 to 5 with clients. I think it's so vitally important to have a conversation about helping the helper and the person behind the counselor and the person behind the frontline worker, just because there is an expectation that in order for someone to come forward and ask for support and help from someone, they need to ask it of someone who has their stuff together. Why would you ever go to someone for advice who can't, support themselves? And that is the image that I'm sure a lot of professionals in a lot of helping professions and a lot of human facing services feel like they need to upkeep in order to be seen as competent, in order to be seen as confident and a professional worthy of leading people through really difficult points in their life. And so as part of my research, I did some interviews with different clinicians in different sites, private practice as well as community mental health, single session crisis intervention, just to kind of get a sense for them, what were the things that contributed most to their workplace emotional distress, which is kind of my umbrella term for things like burnout and compassion fatigue, empathetic strain, as well as some of the things that they used, they recognized in themselves as well as in their organization and their peers and their supervisors to help mitigate some of that distress. And a couple of things that we noticed across all of the people that I interviewed was a factor in their burnout was overall just feeling helpless about their client situation or the person that they're supporting. A lot of people are going to be coming to you with really big feelings, with really complex stories and relationships with people in their lives. And so, to some extent, a lot of this work is about listening, is about validating, and is also about finding and collaborating on next steps that are measurable and achievable for this person to find some amount of comfort and safety and peace with it. But there are going to be some situations where that's not possible, especially in the more short term, especially if you're in a field where you only have one session with someone. So at Kids Help Phone, we only do single session over the phone as counselors, as well as in the texting department, the texting service, it's also a single session model. And so when someone comes to you with this really big thing, you don't really get that closure that you might get from other types of counseling or by supporting someone in your life that you can kind of monitor and see as they grow and as they find their next steps, and feeling really helpless about how much influence you have on their pain can be really, really disempowering for people who entered this field because they wanted to help. Is one of the major things. A couple of the other things that come up a lot in the helping profession is people have very high standards for themselves. They want to do what's right by their client, by their loved ones that they're supporting. And they tend to be very self-critical about their work. Did I do good enough? Could I have gone the extra mile? Could I have stayed an extra couple of minutes to research this thing? Could I have offered them an extra session on my vacation time just to kind of give more of myself to them? And that's also a really tricky boundary for a clinician or a professional to set for themselves is the work is the work, and you as the person are the channel for that work, but you as a person aren't the commodity. So you're not giving up parts of yourself in order to support others. That's not fair to you, it's not fair to them, and it's not sustainable for you if you want to be able to remain in this profession in a way that's long and meaningful and fulfilling. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is especially with COVID and for a lot of nonprofits, the demand and interest in mental health services in general has gone up, and that's great. The types of conversations that we're getting are a lot more vulnerable and sometimes more intense. I say partly in thanks to advocacy and awareness programs such as this, that people are more comfortable reaching out about things that were very taboo and stigmatized before. But then there's that added pressure of, we have a queue, we have a bunch of people waiting. And so if I just took on a little bit more, if I just pushed my own boundary a little bit more, could I have not helped more people? And if I have prioritized my own self-care and my own well-being, was that selfish of me? Am I then letting people down because I'm trying to put myself first when other people are suffering more than I have? And that's a very common mentality in helpers. And I think it's a valid one. That's why people are helping. They want to, bare their soul and give back. But the saying is very common: you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think it's just a relearning that a lot of clinicians and frontliners have to do, that taking care of yourself means that you will show up for your clients in a better and more long-term way that will benefit everyone.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Some amazing insights there. Goodness. Yeah. And I mean, I can imagine, especially with just the shortage of which care providers in general, like across the board in any kind of mental health care position. So I'm curious, how do you navigate that and kind of setting those boundaries, making sure that, you create space to take care of yourself and sit with maybe some of those feelings of like, oh, what could I have done? Or, yeah.
For sure. And that's my favorite part about this, the kind of interviews that I did, is the very first half of a lot of these interviews were a lot of the heaviness and a lot of the pain that a lot of clinicians have been carrying. And then the second half was like, well, then how did you respond to that? How did you mitigate that? How did you, come up with strategies or talk to peers or come up with ways to support and scaffold yourself in this work that allows you to stay in this field long term? Because I oftentimes am interviewing people who are novices in the field, and when I follow up with them, it's 1 or 2 years later and they're still there. And so a couple of the strategies that I noticed in the people I spoke to was, the very clear, like, boundary setting stuff, like we call it like compartmentalizing or disconnecting. So it's tougher when you work from home and, the place that you eat and sleep is literally 10 feet away from where you work. But I think people being very clear about, this is the place where I work, and have it not be the place that I'm also resting and having leisure time. Like the brain and the body, it has muscle memory. And so being able to dedicate spaces for different things is really important, especially when, those two worlds kind of collide when everyone's working from home. Another thing that a lot of folks are doing is taking intentional and nourishing breaks. So that's not just, making sure that you're, breaking for lunch, or you're going to the gym, or whatever you find intentional and nourishing. It could also be, I had some people who were in the middle of their note taking, they would listen to classical music, and they found that a very relaxing way to reset their brain. And then they somehow kind of conditioned themselves to, anytime they heard classical music, they knew that the session was over. And they were able to kind of associate that with a feeling of calm. Some other people also did, they had a candle that was lit during the session, and once the session was over, they blew it out. And so they were able to associate kind of the smell of the ash from the wick as like a conclusion to that really maybe stressful hour that was shared between the two of you, and being really intentional in noticing that in your space, and associating with that with your intentional self-reflections and feeling of calm. And then, of course, like the more practical things is making sure that you're in a workplace, or ensuring that you have adequate like support externally from your organization, getting adequate supervision, as well as getting your own personal support. Like, we would never have a dentist not get their annual checkup. And so why should it be the case for anyone who's on the in a helping profession to not also explore those options for themselves? So advocacy and institutional expectations of self-care, making sure that being well and taking time to set that boundary for yourself being built into your role is a vitally important thing that we're moving towards, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like therapists need therapy. It's so true. And yet there's such a stigma around it, which is just so fascinating. And Have you ever like struggled personally with that stigma, and felt like, oh, I'm, supposed to have it all together in terms of mental health? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think more people should be asked it, honestly. I think when it comes to me personally, I've been very grateful and fortunate that I've always surrounded myself with or associated myself with organizations that were really open to conversations like this. And so having really, being able to normalize something like coming into work and the general question is like, oh, how was your weekend? Or like, how are you doing? And the default is going to be, I'm good, it's fine. And that's the rote answer. And being able to be amongst people and with an organization where it's acceptable to say something other than that is kind of your first cue into, okay, this is a place where I can actually be real. And I think that a lot of the work that people need to do around this is not only, again, finding an organization and finding peers and finding supervisors that subscribe to that same philosophy. But I found a lot of the stigma and the barriers that I found in reaching out for help actually came internally from me. So it was that high standard I set for myself. It's like, well, if I admit that I had a problem, do I completely lack credibility in being able to support people in a completely different issue that's completely different from mine, right? Just being able to recognize that there are two sides, if not multiple sides, to those barriers. It's work that you can do for yourself and reflect on yourself. What are your needs, as well as when you come to terms with what your needs are, is your organization, are your peers, are your colleagues able to provide that for you? And if not, then that's maybe a good cue for you to find someone that can meet your needs. And we would say the exact same thing for our clients. So being able to apply those same standards across the board, we're all human, being able to use those tools on yourself is a really helpful practice, not only for a clinician just to keep your skills up, but also to see what works for me might not work for my client, and vice versa. So always keeping you on your toes and always being open to learning new things and new techniques about things.
Yeah, I love that. And it's reminding me of that saying, like, there's so much that we say to ourselves that we would never say to a friend. And it's kind of a similar, I mean, obviously it's not a friendship relationship per se, but a similar kind of self-talk, and you don't realize how much you like self-stigmatize, which is interesting. So yeah, thank you for touching on that for sure. Yeah.
My favorite, you're right. My favorite quote is, if a friend talked to you the way you talk to you, would you be friends? I think is such a powerful way of framing it. 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's another piece of this that I'd love to get into too, with working with clients and kind of that maintaining confidentiality and not being able to share what is said in sessions or over text. And I'm sure that can be heavy to carry that, because you're maybe not able to really like fully unpack with anybody what it is that you're carrying from those sessions. So how do you navigate that? Or what have you seen in your research as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think the word that comes to mind when I think about confidentiality and listening to pretty intense and vulnerable and emotional stories on a day-to-day basis, and then having to go be a human after that is the word that comes to mind is holding. So as a clinician, as a frontline worker, as a volunteer crisis responder, it's your responsibility to be there to help hold and carry the burden of the emotions that person is kind of sitting there with you, talking it through. And so I've had a lot of experience and comfort with the concept of holding. And I know a lot of clinicians, it's something that they would need to practice, because again, like the reasons for why they would want to join the field is because they want to help, they want to save people, they want to make a difference. And adding that personal element to it is really powerful and very motivating, but it also kind of opens you up to linking your ability to succeed in a clinical setting with your own self-worth. And that's when it can get really dicey. And so being able to acknowledge that holding space for you're holding this burden with them during the time that you're with them, and then you have to let that go. You have to let them re-shoulder that with the tools and the validation and the kind things that we have exchanged during that time, and feel confident that what you've given them is going to help shoulder that responsibility with a little less heaviness. So it's not like you're carrying it with them permanently, especially since you're speaking to so many people every day. What can you do in that time together that will help their burden ease a little bit? And so I think one example that comes to mind when it comes to confidentiality is I've spoken to texters on our texting service, and they were messaging in about current events or breaking news that I haven't heard myself. And so there's something I have to kind of check in my brain is like, okay, I'm feeling a lot of emotions right now because it's the first time I'm hearing about this. And I can very quickly derail this and kind of spotlight my emotions and spotlight kind of how I'm feeling in the moment. And while all of what I'm feeling is valid, the role that I'm stepping into right now is to support them. And so knowing and finding the comfort and verifying for myself that I will have my time to debrief this with someone else in my organization, or at least I'll be able to kind of, if it's not the specific confidentiality, like identifying pieces, I'll be able to express to my colleagues, I'm really overwhelmed today. Something that I heard is really hitting close to home, and being able to share that openly without fear of judgment, I think is a really important way to handle confidentiality so that you don't feel like you're the secret keeper forever. I think the idea that people on the front line doing confidential services is you're not a secret keeper, you're a holder of vulnerable stories that belong to other people. And that secret is not yours to own, nor is it yours to share with anyone outside of the two of you. Of course, if there's safety involved or any kind of risk to self or anything like that, you would be able to bring in other people that can help scaffold that safety. But for the most part, the secret is between the two of you. And then once that conversation ends, it leaves with them. But that's, a lot of other clinicians kind of philosophize it differently, but that's kind of how I've managed to get by.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's reminded me of what you said about the candle too. Like, you hold it for that period of time, and that's your job in that instance, but you don't necessarily have to keep it or let it ride on your shoulders for the rest of the day. Of course, that's easier said than done, but because I'm sure, if you have a particularly struggling client, I'm sure you think about them at other points in the day. But yeah, no, that's so important. And I'm so glad that you have people to kind of unpack some of those things with. Yeah,
for sure.
Awesome. Well, you touched on this a little bit because you're a text crisis responder, which is a little bit different than like a phone call or a session. So I'm curious how that's a bit different, and navigating that maybe feels different and impacts you differently. So yeah, could you touch on anything related to that?
Oh, for sure. I love this this kind of idea that, especially at Kids Help Phone, that young people and now adults coming through texting are able to reach out for the kind of support that they communicate best in. And so now that we both have professional counselors on the phone line and then volunteer crisis responders on the text line, regardless of how you prefer to express yourself, you have options. Right. And so when it comes to the phone counseling line, like you do still have that amount of, you have anonymity on the phone line, in that you don't see your face. You don't have to fill out any paperwork and provide your name or anything. But a lot of people, especially ones that are very expressive and emotive, a lot of information comes from the tone of your voice, the pauses that you take, the big sighs, a lot of that stuff that is really well captured over the phone, you can't get over text or over email or any kind of text-based thing. But research that we've done here at Kids Help Phone has found that a growing majority of young people specifically prefer nonverbal text-based communication. There are a lot of reasons for that. It's more convenient. They're able to do it much more discreetly, as well as, if they're sharing something vulnerable or they're sharing something that might actually put themselves in danger when it comes to facing bullying or abuse in the home, speaking that out loud might actually put them in more danger if the people or the aggressors are nearby. So being able to offer a text-based approach, not only is it more convenient, but it's also a much safer option for a lot of young people. It's a really cool dynamic that we're able to see. Obviously in texting, you don't see, the visible cues in their face, or you don't get those pauses, you don't get those inflections in tone. But we get emojis, which is such a really, it's like a really cool element to all of this. And you know, how expressive young people can be in like the way they phrase things, like acronyms that I've never heard of before. And just it's just a really cool way for them to find ways of expressing a very scary feeling in like the crying emoji. Like that is a very expressive thing to be able to share over text, and you didn't have to say any words. It's a really cool dynamic. And even when it comes to the way I'm speaking right now, like I speak way faster than I type. And so while I'm typing, I'm able to actually be more mindful about what I'm saying because it takes me longer to formulate an answer. And that's one of the things I really love about texting is, you know, I know that it's being delivered in a way that the texter really prefers, as well as, you know, I get a little bit more time by myself. I don't have to think about what my face looks like. I don't have to think about the inflection of my voice. I just have to focus on forming a message that really gets the point across, and making sure that my tone is clear, because, you know, being able to convey tone over text can be really tricky. And then, you know, once you have a little bit more practice with it, it's a really cool skill to have that you can apply literally everywhere.
Yeah, you can curate like a really supportive response in a way that you can't when you're speaking sometimes. I mean, not intentionally necessarily, but
Yeah.
We do our best verbally, but
For
sometimes
sure.
things don't come out the way that maybe we intended or wanted. So it's a really interesting piece that I didn't think about, because I mean, in my head, I was like, oh, you know, you lose a lot, like you said, of like vocal like inflection when you're texting. But then there's this whole other like realm of privacy and safety that comes with that too.
Yeah. And even when it comes to e-mental health services, which are obviously much more popular these days, when you're doing something text-based, sending a URL link or sending a video is way easier to do when it's text-based over other mediums. And so you have a huge arsenal of things that you can share from a resource or referral standpoint when it's text-based that you might have not been able to before.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, I'm so glad that that exists, and like bless Kids Help Phone.
Oh.
Yeah. And kind of along the same lines too. There's been a few times where I've supported a friend who has openly been suicidal and over text. And that's a very scary, I'll say, like tricky thing to navigate, because you want to help, but maybe they don't want any kind of intervention, or, you know, they don't want to go to the hospital or call 911. So that I'm sure can be really heavy for you as well, especially if they're more crisis oriented situations over text. So I'm curious how that impacts you, kind of navigating those situations.
Yeah, for sure. And again, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really incredible thing that we found with a lot of our volunteers, as well as with people, even on the front lines as professionals, people who have lived experience either with their own mental health struggles or supporting loved ones in their lives with their mental health struggles. That's kind of what draws us to this work in general. And I think there also is a really big difference between supporting a loved one that you know and have seen in all kind of scopes of their life versus someone that I'll say a stranger on the internet, but it's much more personal than that. You know, a texter that you might never meet in person, you might never speak to again. I think those are two different camps, and I think they both come with their own individual struggles and heaviness for the person supporting. One thing that I always remind myself when volunteering as a crisis responder, or even supporting someone in my life, is Kids Help Phone as a service, as an organization, is 24/7. You as a person are not.
Yeah.
And so that's a really important boundary and reminder, is like, you know, if you are going to treat yourself as the 24/7 hotline for all of our texters across Canada, or all of the people in my life that need that support, you know, that is maybe not the service operation that would be great for you as a human being. So there are organizations that exist, including Kids Help Phone, that are 24/7, that are bilingual, that are 365 days a year. On all stat holidays, we are open. And so if someone is carrying a lot, but they're not ready to kind of think about next steps in a way that we would traditionally think about next steps, reaching out for help and just talking about it is a huge first step. It might be the end of it. And that might be the end of what they need in order to feel secure and feel heard. But, you know, when we think about Kids Help Phone and we even just deconstruct our name, it's not Kids Crisis Phone, it's Kids Help. And so any realm of what that crisis might look like for that young person or that adult, we are here 24/7 to support. And knowing that, you know, when my shift was over, if they wanted to come back in the middle of the night because they had another revelation or something else happened and they're feeling worse, that I know that someone else is going to be there that I trust and that, you know, has taken the exact same training that I did, and is maybe even better equipped to support them because they're coming at it from fresh eyes. And they're able to kind of meet that texter where they're at in that moment, rather than me coming in with like what I'm like, well, you said this like 6 hours ago, what happened to the plan that we came up with then, you know? So being able to meet where they're at is really the perk of single session, as well as being 24/7. We know that that texter or that caller is always going to be able to reach someone no matter kind of where they're at in their journey with us. And I think that's one of the big comforts, is when you're carrying something really heavy and something that feels very urgent, that you yourself, again, are not the 24/7 service, but you don't also represent all of the resources that this person has available to them. And so you're with them in the moment to connect them with other things that might be helpful. You're not the only like life raft available. You're the one who's maybe like at the dock pointing to that metaphor didn't work, but like, you know, they're at the dock, they came to the dock with you, and they have a lot of options that you can guide them towards. And you know, you don't have to feel like solely responsible for the well-being of that person. The best you can do is be an open space and make sure that they know that there are a lot of options for them whenever they're ready, really.
Yeah. That's a great response. And I love that analogy too, of like being at the dock and kind of showing all the different directions. And that's maybe the best thing we can do as supporters. Like, I'm not a professional, and a lot of times I get caught like, which direction do I point this person in, because I really care about them and want to help. And I think that's a great like thing to say and teach people, is just, you know, try and know as best you can what different options are and where you can point people to.
Exactly.
Yeah. Kind of like, well, pivoting a little bit. You mentioned this a little bit, like lived experience and your own story definitely playing a role in getting involved in mental health care, being a text crisis responder. And I know there's kind of this neutrality that has to be maintained, and you're a bit of a step back and in that supportive role. But how, if at all, do you use your own lived experience or your personal story to navigate certain conversations? And how does that impact you and your mental health too?
I love this question. And in kind of the clinical world, the phrase that we use a lot when we're thinking about how our own lived experience or how we're responding and reacting to things in our world might impact the way that you respond to your client is called countertransference. It's very Freudian. And so one of the things that we're always kind of looking at is, well, can countertransference actually be a positive thing? And when can it really get away from us and become something negative? When is it going to suddenly take the client or the texter or the caller out of the driver's seat, and then you're in there being like, I'm driving this with my emotions, I'm driving this with my experience. And even though our lived experience, maybe what they're coming in with is very similar to what I have, and some of that empathy and understanding will lend well to building that rapport and trust between the two of you. Kind of exploring and unpacking my stuff is not what I'm there for. In that moment, it is still, again, a valid experience, and it deserves its own time, maybe on the other side of that hour when you can go talk to your supervisor, you can go talk to your own personal counselor. But there are elements that you would need to hold then for yourself, you know, being able to be aware, be mindful of some of the things that are coming up for you. I think a phrase that we use a lot is bowing to it, acknowledging it, like tipping my hat. I tip my hat to this feeling of whatever that is coming up for me right now. park it and address it when the session is over. And then on the other hand, there is some merit to disclosing that. So you can say that a texter, or not a texter, actually, this wouldn't be something we would ask our volunteers to do, but in the professional sphere, we could, to some extent, mirror and advocate for and encourage expressive language. And so if a caller or a client is describing an incident or an event in their life where a friend or a family member really breached a boundary with them, and they're getting very activated by it, but they can't really name what it is that was upsetting, or they couldn't really name the emotion that they're feeling. In some cases, it could be appropriate for you to say, if that were to happen to me, I could imagine that was really stepping on my boundary, and I would maybe be disappointed. I could be upset. I could be quite angry and pushing back on this person for breaching that. And I'm wondering if any of those emotions are resonating with you. So as opposed to being like, well, you should feel this way because this is how I feel, kind of inviting a dialogue and being like, I could imagine that with a lot of tentifiers and a lot of the intention behind the self-disclosure needs to be clinically minded. It can't be like, well, I'm venting because I need to vent this. That is for another time. That's where you need to practice the holding. But if the intent behind the self-disclosure is to make the space feel like a safe space to share things like that, that is when it's appropriate. And that's actually a little bit tougher for different service models to do, especially when there is no like long-term relationship building between like the client and the counselor. For our volunteers, for example, we don't encourage personal self-disclosure because it's not meant to be counseling. It's not meant to be a replacement for long-term or short-term counseling. Our volunteers are there to be active listeners and to collaboratively discover next steps alongside the texter, because the texter is the expert in their lives, in their own lives. And so the issue of kind of having your lived experience kind of, infiltrate's not the right word because that's kind of inherently negative, but for your lived experience to influence the direction in which your session goes can both be a dangerous thing from a clinical standpoint, and also a really healthy and validating thing. And so what I've seen, and this is the thing that gets me kind of really excited and happy, is a lot of people are taking their lived experience, and rather than inserting it in like these specific scenarios, it's motivating them in general to give back. It's motivating them in general to be like, I know what it's like to go through this specific thing. And I want to put myself in a scenario or take on a role to make sure that people going through the same thing I did don't have it as hard. They have resources. They know that this is something that a lot of people have gone through and they're not alone. So the lived experience piece I'm finding these days is less of a concern around confidentiality, at least with our volunteers, and more of a really motivating factor in giving back and helping out based on the things that they've learned with their own journey.
Yeah, that's so amazing and good to hear. And it's almost like, well, I know for myself, like there's so many times where I had an experience and I just didn't have the language to describe it. And, how helpful it would have been if my therapist or whoever is sitting across from me could kind of give me that language, maybe from their own journey and what they've learned and the language that they've learned, without, totally unpacking their whole experience. I think that's a really, really beautiful way to give back. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Amazing. Well, I think we've almost got through all of our questions. Amazing. And you've given such amazing responses. And I appreciate them so much. Really my last question, or actually we'll do two more. Second last one. What do you wish patients or clients or texters knew kind of coming in?
I think one of the things that we're coming across, especially during COVID, with our numbers going up, I think one of the things that we always notice when it comes to our data is conversations around suicide and self-harm are also increasing. Specifically during COVID, conversations around abuse in the home and body image are increasing. And a lot of people look at those stats and being like, oh, Canada's in crisis. We're having such a hard time navigating this pandemic and what it means for our ability to be independent, to feel safe in our space and all this kind of stuff. And while a lot of that is true, I think one of the things that is really important for us to consider on the flip side is people are reaching out. The numbers are going up because they're feeling comfortable and safer to actually reach out to an organization or to a service like Kids Help Phone and to express those things. I wouldn't imagine that even 10 years ago that having an open conversation about suicide and using the word suicide, self-harm, self-injury, abuse kind of in the general lexicon without it being this like big boogeyman in like news stories or something. They're not sensationalized, they're sincere, and they're coming from people who are survivors. It's coming from people who are still in the middle of it. It's coming from people who went through it, are still going through it, and then are now on the helping side. I think that's one of the most remarkable things about everything that's come out of this industry over the last few years is stigma is still a thing. And certainly there are, cultural differences and language differences when it comes to what topics are and aren't acceptable to talk about openly. But one thing that I'm really taking away from all of the incredible work that people have been doing, and our texters specifically, I would love them to know that there are some texters who have become crisis responders. There are a lot of people who called into our phone lines as kids that are now staff here at Kids Help Phone. And so, I think the fact that we're not two different breeds of people. It's not people who are struggling and then the people who are doing really well and are here to guide you and give advice. We are all people. And we're all just at different stages in our journey and in our ability and readiness to give back some of those learnings that we've accumulated over the years. I think that's one of the things that kind of helps with the stigma of it, or the fear around reaching out to a service like this is like, oh, they're going to judge me. There are others. There's a big difference between them and us. And certainly there can be. But just that reminder, especially when I think about the volunteers, the number of people who are members of the general public. At first, before the pandemic, a lot of our volunteers were teachers, were nurses, were doctors, were people already kind of in the helping profession. And now with kind of this outpouring of support from people all over Canada, we have people in all industries, of all ages, of all genders, wanting to give back. And they are ready and open to having these kind of uncomfortable conversations that they never would have had a couple of years ago, because they see the value in it, not only in giving the support to this perfect stranger on the internet, but also being able to apply some of the things that they're learning as a crisis responder in their own lives. We get so many notes from volunteers saying like, this training, this volunteer experience has made me a better parent. It's made me a better sibling. It's made me a better employee. And I think elements of active listening and compassion and validation, it's just a universal skill that can apply to every single realm. And, just because there's a moment in your life where you need to reach out and give that help, it doesn't mean that you can't kind of pay it forward whenever you're ready. We're all kind of whole, complex people. Nuance is a thing. And it's just a really uplifting thing to see how many people who have kind of experienced the mental health field from so many different entry points, either from like the helping entry point or the helpy entry point. It's just so comforting to know that so many people who are in the field know what it's like to be on the other end of it. They're truly coming at this with so much warmth and compassion. And it's very different from what the mental health field looked like, a couple of decades ago, when it was very prescriptive. It was very, you are sick and I am healthy and I'm going to tell you what to do. It's much more well-rounded and grounded in the reality that is a lot of people in this country. So that's, in not so many words, that's what I would love for our, both our frontline people as well as the people who reach out to our service to know.
Yeah. Amazing. And that was my second question, or follow-up question, was like, what would you say to the mental health care providers in that community? But I think you covered it so well, unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
Oh gosh, in terms to all frontline people, to all people on the mental health side, as well as the medical side, the people who are helping society get by in all of this that we have been dealing with for the last few years, if not the last, long time, decades of what kind of people have been struggling with. Just an enormous amount of thanks, an enormous amount of gratitude, and that for a lot of people, some of these things can be taken for granted, and it's going to be something that is expected. But in order to show up for work every day and to do that holding and to set that boundary and to remember that you are a part of a bigger system that also wants to see you succeed and be healthy. Just to be able to like take all of that infinite kindness and generosity that you are putting out into the world and turn it inwards every now and then. I think that's a really important thing that people on the front lines need a reminder to do, because it's so incredibly difficult. But yeah, just so much gratitude for the folks who are doing frontline work that is much harder than what I'm doing, which is sitting at my desk and talking to people over text. And it's very difficult, but I'm not in the hospitals. I'm not on the front lines trying to do online classes and that kind of thing. It's all very nuanced, and it's all very difficult, and all of it is frontline, and all of it's important. So it's just an enormous amount of gratitude, and I hope that they can turn any amount of that compassion inwards when because they deserve it 1,000,000%.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And just that message that like, just because you're giving so much and maybe you do have some expertise doesn't mean you can't struggle with the thing you're supposed to be an expert in.
Right.
And that's such an important thing. And I think it gets forgotten sometimes because you're like, oh, I have to keep giving. And like you said earlier, you can't pour from an empty cup. So yeah. Well, that is all I had questions wise. Thank you so much. This was amazing. I learned so much too, like just my own mental health journey and supporting the people in my life who I know struggle. So this was amazing. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about this again. I could talk about it literally till the cows come home, and any opportunity where we can, openly discuss what it's like to be on the front lines and to be someone who's being asked to hold a lot of heavy stuff from other people. It's an incredible role, and I think it deserves a lot of credit, a lot of attention.
Agreed. Yeah. I guess my very last thing is if there's anything I didn't ask about that you'd like to share, because this will hopefully we'll put this interview up on Unsinkable and share it as broadly as we can. So yeah, if there's anything else, that I didn't ask that you'd like to share.
Yeah, sure. I think, if folks are interested in kind of exploring this volunteer opportunity with us, we are recruiting for volunteer crisis responders, and they're more than welcome to visit us on our gateway at kidshelpzone.ca or jeunesse.ca if you are French. We're looking for bilingual volunteers as well. And if you are looking for support, or you want someone to bounce ideas around, or you're in crisis, or you're worried about a friend, really anything, again, it's not just crisis, it's any kind of help or support. They're welcome to text 686868 to they're welcome to text the word connect to the number 686868 if they're a youth, and if they're an adult, they can text connect as well to 741-741, and they'll be connected to one of our trained volunteer crisis responders. And there are a lot of other resources on our gateway. Again, like I'm just leading people to the doc. There are so many resources out there, and regardless of kind of what your readiness is to talk to a person or talk to a volunteer kind of over text, there are a lot of independent quizzes and surveys. We have a really friendly robot on our website called Kip, who can redirect you to different articles that you might be interested in. There's so many different entry points into the Kids Help Phone kind of ethos. And so I welcome people to take a look and see, in what way could we kind of do this incredible work together.
Amazing. I'm going to go have to make friends with Kip now. Oh goodness.
That's super cute.
Yeah. And like very last thing I'll add is like, I love what you said about, it's not just about crisis. Mental health isn't reserved for moments of crisis. That's just so important. And I think a good message to end on. So
amazing. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I guess I'll hit the stop recording.